In the autumn of 1492, a lookout aboard a small wooden ship spotted something no European had reported seeing before. Land where the map said there should be nothing but open ocean. For weeks, the crew had been sailing further from any known coastline than any European sailor on record. Many of them believed they were going to die out there, in water that, as far as they knew, had no other edge. What they found instead would reshape the world. Empires would rise and collapse because of it. Millions of people would die because of it, most of them not from swords or guns, but from diseases carried unknowingly across the ocean by the very ships that found this land. And the man who led that voyage would spend the rest of his life defending a version of events that was, in more ways than most people realize, not quite true. Tonight we're going to trace that voyage and the man behind it carefully and slowly. Not the simplified version taught in most classrooms, but the fuller picture, including the parts of the story that tend to get left out. There's no need to hold onto every date or name. Just follow along and let the details settle wherever they settle. Christopher Columbus was born around 1451 in the Italian port city of Genoa, the son of a wool weaver. Genoa was a major maritime trading power at the time, and from a young age, Columbus was surrounded by sailors, merchants, and the constant traffic of ships moving goods across the Mediterranean. He went to sea as a teenager, and by his 20s had survived at least one shipwreck, washing ashore in Portugal, a country that would shape much of his later ambitions. Portugal, in the late 15th century, was the leading maritime power in Europe, having spent decades methodically exploring the western coast of Africa, searching for a sea route to the spice markets of Asia. Columbus studied these voyages closely and eventually developed his own theory, one that most experienced navigators of the time considered deeply flawed. He believed that Asia could be reached faster by sailing west across the Atlantic, rather than around the southern tip of Africa. The problem wasn't that educated people of the time thought the Earth was flat. That's a common misconception. Nearly every scholar and navigator involved understood the Earth was round. The actual disagreement was about size. Columbus had significantly underestimated the Earth's circumference, and therefore believed Asia was only a few thousand miles west of Europe. In reality, the distance was far greater, and an entire pair of continents that Europeans didn't yet know existed sat in between. Portugal's own navigators reviewed Columbus's calculations and rejected his proposal, believing correctly that his numbers didn't add up. Columbus spent years afterward petitioning other courts across Europe, seeking a monarch willing to fund an expedition based on a calculation nearly everyone else considered mistaken. Eventually, after years of rejection, Columbus found support from Queen Isabella I and King Ferdinand II of Spain, who had just completed a long military campaign to unify their kingdom and were looking for ways to compete with Portugal's growing wealth and influence. They agreed to fund a modest expedition, offering Columbus significant rewards if he succeeded, including a share of any wealth discovered and a noble title. On the 3rd of August, 1492, Columbus departed from the port of Palos in southern Spain with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, and a combined crew of around 90 men. The journey west across open ocean, further from land than most of the crew had ever sailed, grew increasingly tense as the weeks passed without any sign of land. There are accounts, though historians debate their accuracy, suggesting the crew came close to mutiny, convinced they had sailed into an endless, empty ocean with no way back. On the 12th of October, 1492, a lookout aboard the Pinta spotted land. It was an island in what we now call the Bahamas, inhabited by a native people known as the Taino. Columbus, believing he had reached islands off the coast of Asia, called the people he encountered Indios, a name that, through a long chain of historical confusion, is where the term Indian, when applied to Native Americans, originates. The Taino people who greeted Columbus's ships were, by multiple accounts, welcoming and curious, offering food, water, and gifts to the newly arrived strangers. Columbus, in his own journal, described them as a gentle, generous people. In that same journal, within days of that description, he was already writing about how easily they could be conquered and put to work. This is where the story most people learn tends to end, or at least tends to soften considerably. Columbus made a total of 4 voyages across the Atlantic between 1492 and 1504, and the later voyages reveal a very different picture than the story of discovery most often told. On his second voyage, Columbus returned with a much larger fleet, 17 ships, and around 1,500 men, with clear intentions of establishing permanent settlements and extracting wealth from the islands he'd found. He was appointed governor of these new territories, a role in which his actual conduct became increasingly documented and increasingly troubling even to his own contemporaries. Columbus and his brothers, who assisted in governing the growing Spanish settlements, implemented a system requiring the Taino population to deliver a quota of gold every few months. Those who failed to meet the quota faced severe punishment, including reports of mutilation. Historical accounts from the period, including those written by Spanish colonists themselves, describe forced labor, enslavement, and violence carried out against the native population under Columbus's governance, on a scale that shocked even some of his contemporaries in an era not generally known for gentleness toward conquered peoples. A Spanish priest named Bartolomé de las Casas, who initially participated in the colonization effort himself before becoming one of its most vocal critics, documented much of what he witnessed in the following years. His writings describe forced labor in gold mines, families separated, and brutal punishments inflicted on those who resisted or failed to meet demands. Las Casas would later spend much of his life advocating, with limited success, for better treatment of native populations across Spanish territories. The population collapse that followed Columbus's arrival in the Caribbean is difficult to overstate. Estimates vary considerably, but historians generally agree that within a few decades of European contact, the native Taino population had been reduced by the overwhelming majority through a combination of forced labor, violence, and most significantly, diseases like smallpox and influenza, to which native populations had no prior immunity. Some islands that had supported thriving native communities for centuries were, within a generation, almost entirely depopulated of their original inhabitants. Columbus's governance of the colonies became controversial even by the standards of the Spanish crown that had appointed him. Complaints from colonists, along with reports of mismanagement and excessive cruelty, eventually reached Spain in enough volume that the crown sent an official to investigate. In 1500, Columbus and his brothers were arrested and returned to Spain in chains, stripped of their governorship, though Columbus was eventually released and permitted to make a fourth and final voyage a few years later, this time explicitly forbidden from governing any settlements directly. That fourth voyage was, by most accounts, difficult. Columbus's ships, aging and poorly maintained, were eventually stranded for over a year on the island of Jamaica after becoming too damaged to sail further, and Columbus and his remaining crew waited for rescue in increasingly desperate conditions before finally returning to Spain in 1504. Columbus died in 1506, still convinced, or at least still publicly insisting, that the lands he'd found were part of Asia, never fully acknowledging that he'd encountered a set of continents entirely unknown to Europeans prior to his voyages. Ironically, the credit for recognizing these as new continents went to another Italian navigator, Amerigo Vespucci, whose name was eventually used to label the new landmasses, rather than Columbus's own. For centuries afterward, Columbus was celebrated in a fairly simplified way, credited with courage, vision, and the discovery of a new world. Countries and cities across the Americas named streets, monuments, and even an entire nation's capital district after him. It wasn't until relatively recently, as more of the primary historical documents were studied and translated, along with the accounts of contemporaries like Las Casas, that the fuller picture of his governance and its consequences became more widely known and discussed. It's worth sitting with the complexity of this, rather than resolving it too neatly. Columbus was, without question, an extraordinarily skilled navigator, someone whose determination and technical seamanship accomplished something most of his contemporaries considered impossible or unwise. He also oversaw a colonial system responsible for tremendous suffering, based on incomplete and mistaken assumptions about the world's geography, arriving at a destination he never correctly understood and setting in motion consequences for both the native populations he encountered and the broader course of world history that he could not have fully anticipated and, based on his own writings, seemed to show limited concern for. The voyages themselves connected two hemispheres that had developed separately for thousands of years, setting off an enormous exchange of plants, animals, diseases, and people, sometimes called the Columbian Exchange. Crops like potatoes, tomatoes, and corn moved from the Americas to Europe, Africa, and Asia, eventually becoming dietary staples in places that had never known them before. Horses, cattle, and wheat moved in the opposite direction, transforming agriculture and daily life across the Americas. Alongside these exchanges came diseases that devastated native populations, and within a few decades, the beginnings of the transatlantic slave trade, as European colonizers sought a new labor source to replace the native populations decimated by disease and mistreatment. The 4 small ships that departed from a Spanish port in 1492 set in motion changes that would reshape nearly every aspect of life on both sides of the Atlantic, for better and for considerably worse, depending on which side of that history your ancestors happened to be standing on. Columbus himself never fully grasped the scale of what his voyages had set in motion. He died believing he'd found a westward route to Asia, unaware that he'd stumbled onto something the existing maps of his world had no place for at all. In that sense, the story of Columbus isn't really a story about discovery in the way it's often told. It's a story about a man who was wrong about where he was, wrong about what he'd found, and largely unconcerned with the cost paid by the people who were already living there when he arrived. The islands themselves remain, still shaped by that history in ways both visible and quiet. Names on modern maps, from the Caribbean islands to entire continents, still carry the residue of those 4 voyages, 5 centuries later. The Taino people, though their population was devastated, were not entirely erased. Their genetic and cultural influence persists today across the Caribbean, in language, in food, in traditions passed down despite everything working against their survival. There's a natural instinct to want history to resolve into a simple story, a hero or a villain, a clean beginning and a clean ending. Columbus resists that kind of resolution. He was a genuinely skilled sailor who accomplished something remarkable through sheer persistence, having been rejected repeatedly before finally securing support for his voyage. He also governed with a level of cruelty that alarmed even his own era, and built a colonial system whose consequences unfolded across centuries and continents in ways far larger than anything he intended or understood. The ships have long since rotted away. The Santa Maria ran aground and was dismantled for materials during that very first voyage, its wood repurposed into a small fort built on the island of Hispaniola. The Nina and the Pinta sailed on for some years afterward, their eventual fates less precisely documented, fading gradually out of the historical record the way most ships eventually do. What remains isn't the ships, or even really the man. What remains is the world those voyages helped create, connected in ways it had never been before, for reasons that were, if you trace them back carefully enough, considerably more complicated and considerably less heroic than the simplified version most of us were taught as children. That's where we'll leave it for tonight. 4 small ships, a navigator who was wrong about nearly everything except his own determination, and a world reshaped by a series of events that started with a lookout on an October morning in 1492, spotting land where the maps insisted there should only be open water.